And the next day, they were dead, allegedly shot while they were walking towards the Sri Lankan army lines, carrying a white flag. I mean, you've spent hundreds of hours with these people. How do you carry something like that?
In the 1980s and 90s, he rose through Norwegian politics as a party leader, parliamentarian, and one of the most recognizable voices of the Scandinavian left. Then in the early 2000s, as Norway's special envoy to Sri Lanka, he became the man in the middle of one of Asia's most brutal civil wars between the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE, brokering a ceasefire that held on for years. He went on to lead the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, shaping how the world's wealthiest nations spend their aid. Then came the UN, where he served as executive director of the UN Environmental Program, the world's highest environmental office. And today he's in Beijing as president of the Belt and Road Green Development Institute, pushing the largest infrastructure program in human history to go green, arguing that China's Belt and Road is the single biggest environmental decision of our era. This is Erik Solheim on From the Island.
Every nation comes to a conclusion. The sun is Sri Lankan, wind is Sri Lankan, rivers in Sri Lanka are Sri Lankan. Then for every drop of oil you replace with solar or wind energy, well, Sri Lanka becomes more energy independent. China has spent the last 10 years becoming energy independent. I mean, every bus in China now is electric, every scooter is electric, trucks are electric, 60% of all new cars are electric. Well, that brings drastically down the amount of oil you need to import and is fueled by sun, which is Chinese.
Erik Solheim, welcome to From the Island. So,
it's my pleasure. Happy to be with you.
Thank you. So, you found yourself through fate, I would say, in the middle of one of Asia's bloodiest civil wars in Sri Lanka. You've met the LTTE leader Prabhakaran over 10 times, including all the infamous stakeholders. And you were mediating negotiations between the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE on behalf of Norway. You've also gone on to mediate in Sudan, Myanmar, Burundi, Nepal, etc. But from my understanding, none of this was actually planned. You didn't strategically get into this. So let's start there. How did you find yourself in this position?
It's kind of very funny because there was, as you said, was absolutely no plan. First time I came to Sri Lanka, it was to write a book. Not about Sri Lanka, but a book about Norwegian politics. But I was invited by a friend who happened to live in Colombo. And he said, why don't you come down to Colombo? It's beautiful here, the food is great, the sun is always shining. And by the way, you don't have your children there. And there is no Norwegian journalist trying to follow you there. So you can be in complete silence and write your book. And I did that. But during that visit, I also had the opportunity to meet a few Sri Lankan leaders. It was then Foreign Minister Hamid, who was at the time a very, very stalwart of Sri Lankan politics. Nilan Tiruchelvan, who later was murdered by the Tigers. And Karajal Surya was at the time, he's now in the UNEP, but at the time mayor of Colombo. So I met a few leaders and got some insights, but I have absolutely zero plan of in any way being involved with Sri Lanka.
Very interesting. So you've formed connections with them by chance, and because of the connections, they wanted you to mediate?
We were then approached by the Tamil Tigers. They came to Oslo and asked, can Norway mediate in a future peace process? It was not peace process at the time. It can be mediate in a future peace process between the government and the Tamil Tigers. The time the big issue was how to get Anton Balasingam, the chief negotiator of the Tamil Tigers, out to Sri Lanka for health treatment. So that was a kind of proxy for how to get into negotiations. Shantika Kumaratunga, the president at the time, she had proposed France as a mediator. That was immediately rejected by the Tamil Tigers because they said, you Shantika, you speak French, we don't. So you will have an advantage because she had studied in Paris back in the days. So they rejected France as not neutral since she had a connection to I don't think that was a really good argument, but that was what happened. And then Norway was so far away, so small, cannot harm anyone. So they decided Norway could be the potential negotiator, and that's how we got into it. But probably if I had not been in Sri Lanka in the first place, maybe the LTTE would not have contacted us either.
Right. So they agreed to Norway being the chief mediator, particularly because they had a relationship with you?
No, not with me, but Norway, of course, also had the reputation from some other peace processes in the Middle East. And again, we were far away. India, of course, was important because India had in many different ways interacted with the peace process in Sri Lanka, and they wanted someone who was acceptable to India. So for all these reasons, they thought maybe Norway can be the country. And in the beginning, it was completely secret. In Colombo, only two persons knew.
Really?
That was President Chandrika and then Foreign Minister Lakshman Kadhigamar. Not even the Prime Minister was informed of what we did. And of course, we cannot share it with anyone. I can hardly share it with my wife because if it was so secret in Colombo, you couldn't share it with anyone else. We were very lucky because the Norwegian ambassador's house was just beside the house of Lakshman Kadhigamar, the Foreign Minister. So we just went through the fence into house of Kadhigamar, and they spoke without getting any attention from the press or media.
Okay, so I mean that's
So later, after maybe 2 years, Chandrika then explained to the BBC our role, and then it was all in the open and completely different.
okay, but that's a very disorientating position to be in, right? You come here to write a book, and suddenly you're asked to mediate one of the bloodiest civil wars in the region. What led you to saying yes to that?
I think maybe more important than anything, the need for peace. You know that when you embark upon something like this, it may fail. Maybe it's more likely to fail than to succeed, because many peace processes are failing. But I think it's a duty to try. I mean, look, now we have a war between Iran and the United States. I really thank Pakistan for being negotiating that peace process. I mean, with Oman, with Turkey, China has played a role also. But we should give all credit to them for trying. Even if it's not successful, we need more peace. And the more wars we can find a peaceful solution rather than continue the war, the better.
We'll definitely get into that because we have arguments about that all the time.
Yeah, between ourselves.
So between ourselves, so
Yeah.
we'll like your opinion. So could you take us through the very beginning? So this started in 1998, the peace process, right? Norway was approached by both the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE simultaneously. Could you run us through that? What were those first conversations like, and what were you actually walking into? You can start from the very beginning.
The first very modest beginning was how to bring Anton Balasingham, the chief negotiator and the political advisor of the Tamil Tigers. Really, the one person who could advise Mr. Prabhakaran how to get him out of Sri Lanka, because he was a diabetic. He could not function without dialysis or even kidney transplant. So he needed to be taken out of Sri Lanka. And we discussed up and down for maybe 1 year how to do that. We didn't reach an agreement, and ultimately the LTTE smuggled him out in one of their boats to Thailand. And from Thailand he went to the UK and then set up his office there. And after that, I normally met him in London. That's how it started. But then on that basis, gradually it came into a much broader peace process. There was also a shift in politics in Sri Lanka in 2001 when Ranil Wickremesinghe became the prime minister. So there were many developments, also military developments. I mean, some Sinhalese believe that LTTE entered into the peace process because it was weak. It was exactly the opposite. This was the point in history where LTTE was the absolute strongest. As you may recall, they destroyed more or less the Bandra airport. They wiped out a huge number of aircraft there and crushed the Sri Lankan economy. They overtook the Elephant Pass, very close to overtaking all the Jaffna Peninsula. Just Pakistan weapons in the last phase saved the Sri Lankan army in the peninsula. So the LTTE was very strong at that time. And then they entered into peace process. Then Ranil Wickremesinghe came in as the prime minister, and that's how it was taken to a new level. But the peace process was initiated by Chandrika, then overtaken by Ranil, and then of course later Chandrika came back as the key driver of the peace process.
Okay, and I mean, you mentioned Balasingham. you've said that if Balasingham had made the decisions at the end, that the outcome would be very, very different. Now, if you take a personality like Balasingham and compare that to a personality like Prabhakaran, what are the key differences? Is there a clash?
These two personalities were, in a way, absolutely different. I mean, Prabhakaran had spent his entire life fighting military wars or conflicts, guerrilla attacks in Sri Lanka, and for some period in India. He started killing the mayor of Jaffna town in 1975, I think it was, at the age of 20. He was a throughout military man with no formal education. Well, it was art for sure. He was a great military leader. But he was a military man who tended to see the solution to every problem as a military problem. If I don't like you, I kill you off. Balasingham was completely different. He was an intellectual. He had enormous knowledge of the world outside Sri Lanka. He understood American or Indian politics very, very well. Understood the issues related to constitution or federalism. All these, he had a profound understanding of all this. He had worked for some years also in the UK embassy in Colombo. So one was the elder statesman intellectual, one was the younger guerrilla fighter, but in a way they needed each other. Prabhakaran definitely needed the advice, the wisdom of Balasingham, but of course Balasingham could not run a guerrilla war. Only Prabhakaran could run the war and did it also in a very vicious way. So they were, like in my view, like an old couple. They needed each other. They had many conflicts, but after every conflict, they tended to come back to each other because of that they needed each other for the purpose they had set, which of course was either a separate state or autonomous in northern Sri Lanka, or at the very minimum a self-ruled entity within Sri Lanka.
So what was the ceasefire agreement was signed in 2002, February of 2002. So that's a 4-year piece. That's a 4-year negotiating process to get to the ceasefire. What was that process like? So Ranil Wickremesinghe, you said, as he entered, kind of changed it and allowed this to happen. So what did he do differently to ensure the ceasefire happened?
Look, it may be, when you know what happened later, a bit difficult to understand, but at that time, the peace process was enormously popular in Sri Lanka. I think 95% of all Tamils, as well as all Sinhalese, supported the peace process. They were so tired of the war, they seen the destruction, as we mentioned, the Bangalore airport and a lot of other destruction, they wanted peace. And Ranil Wickremesinghe captured that moment with his two core people, was G.L. Pires, who was later foreign minister, and Milinda Moragoda, who spread many different roles in Sri Lankan politics. These were the 2 point men, and Ranil worked with them. On the LTTE side, Balasingham was always the key person. It may have been a mistake that Chandrika was not involved in the peace process from that point, because as you may recall, there was a separation in Sinhala politics between the two main parties. As UNEP, led by Ranil Wickremesinghe, and Sri Lanka Freedom Party, led by Chandrika, they hated each other. They fought very strongly. Sometimes I felt that both of them hated each other more than they hated Prabhakaran and the LTTE. Because they were competing for the same seats in the parliament and the same seats in government and the same power in Colombia.
Competition.
So, but at the time, it was a peace process between the UNP, led by Ranil Wickremesinghe, and the LTTE. And for the first 2 years, it was very successful. There were no killings. Not
exactly.
As I'm aware, not one Sinhalese or one Tamil was killed by either of the two sides. So that was very successful for some time. But then gradually it unraveled.
Yeah, actually, one structural flaw I kind of found in the ceasefire agreement was that there was no arms control during this period. And correct me if I'm wrong, but during the ceasefire, the LTTE did engage in eliminating Tamil political opponents who were advocating for an agreement and a long-term peaceful solution. And they used that time to actually eliminate the moderates within the LTTE in assassinations. Am I right in that?
I'm not aware that LTTE killed off Tamil opponents in the period of the ceasefire, but for sure they did it all the time before and they did it later. That's one of the ugly sides of the LTT. Any Tamil leader who could challenge Prabhakaran was basically killed off. I mean, back in the 1980s, there were many Tamil militant groups. I mean, at that time there were maybe 6 or 7 different Tamil groups, and the LTT established itself as the dominant group. Yes, it was the more attractive to people because it was more well organized, fighting harder, but also killing off the leaders of all the other groups. Some of them in the bloodbath. So you're right that LTT killed off all other leaders, but not at the peak of the peace process, because then there were strong forces to reduce that kind of activities.
Okay,
And of course later they killed off Lakshman Kalliramar,
Yeah,
was another Tamil leader. They killed off before the peace process started. Nilan Tirushelvan was a Tamil spokesperson in Colombo. So yes, they wanted to establish the LTT as the one and only spokes organization for the Tamils, and had no other Tamil voices in the politics. That was their view.
Okay, but I mean, Chanil is right in that the ceasefire agreement didn't really have a provision for control of arms dealings. And I believe that both sides, the government as well as the LTT, actually spent those 2 years equipping themselves with more weapons. So do you think if a provision had been included, that process would have been more successful, that would have held together better?
This is a very good question, and I cannot give a definite answer, but look, when the peace process started, the LTT wanted the government to promise not to rearm. But Rana Wickremesinghe, the government, said, no, that's not on the cards. We cannot stop modernizing our armed forces. By the way, if we stop modernizing our armed forces, we can also bring our generals and the armed forces with us in the peace process, because they want, of course, to modernize. As every armed force in the world, if you're the armed force of the United States or China, of course, you constantly modernize. So Sri Lanka said we need to modernize our forces, which means also buying new equipment. Then the LTT said, well, that will shift the balance of power during the peace process if you rearm. So we will also then bring in more weapons to keep the balance. That was the LTT argument. However, of course, what really created the difficulty was that the only way LTT could bring in arms was through ships. There was no other way. And of course, ships meant area where the Sri Lankan Navy was active, and of course, Sri Lankan Navy wanted to stop these activities. So gradually, that created more and more difficulties for LTT in small fishing vessels or whatever it was, trying to bring in weapons, and the Sri Lankan Navy. In the beginning, they took the view that they would just look another way, not creating any problem. But over time, it's not easy for a navy just to look another way when you see someone smuggling weapons into your land. So that created a constant friction, a constant problem. And most of the dangerous incidents during the peace process were at sea, caused by this issue that the Tamil Tigers were trying to smuggle in weapons, and the Sri Lankan Navy wanted to stop that. There were also some incidents at land, but mainly at sea. None of these incidents at the peak of the peace process caused any people's life, and there were no killings, but there were a lot of tensions. Then brought in also a ceasefire monitoring mission called Sri Lanka Monitoring Mission, who tried to, whenever there was a crisis, tried to calm down and avoid any sort of fighting or shooting.
Okay, so if I'm getting the timeline right, just a few months after the CFA was signed, the Oslo Declaration came about in March, December 2002. What was the Oslo Declaration? What was in it? How did it come about?
That was LTT accepting a phrase which said that they will accept to explore federalism as solution to the conflict. Look, throughout this, there were two different ways. I mean, the Sri Lankan government said we need to urgently come to the core issues, which is what will be the provisions for a Tamil homeland in northern Sri Lanka, which will be inside Sri Lanka, but we had different powers. And the LTTE said, no, first we need to resolve the issues for our people, we need to have better food, better clothing, better houses, we need to resolve economic and social issues first, and then come to this later. That created a constant problem. The government didn't want to protect the peace process, while the LTTE wanted a protected peace process. So the breakthrough also was that the LTTE said we will explore federalism as a solution. And everyone at the time, of course, knew that federalism was the only possible negotiated outcome, because a centralized state from Colombo could only happen by a military victory for the government, and a separate state can only happen by a military victory for the LTTE. Even that would have been very difficult, because I don't think India would have accepted a separate Tamil state, so it would be very, very hard. But federalism was the compromise. Federalism could take many, many different ways. I mean, India's federal, Switzerland's federal, Germany's federal, Malaysia's federal. There are so many federal models in the world, and we tried to explore different federal models. I have to say, I think a main reason why the peace process ultimately failed was that, yes, Prabhakaran accepted it was Balasingham who made this formulation. If you want to, we had some backroom deals with Namuragoda, myself, and Balasingham, and he accepted his formulation of exploring federalism. But I think he thought he could bring Prabhakaran on board later, but Prabhakaran never took the part to accept federalism as a solution. He may have understood that would have to be the consequence of the peace process, but I think he deep down always wanted a separate state and struggled to accept federalism, and that was one of the core reasons why the peace process ultimately failed.
So, having met Prabhakaran many times, what can you tell us about his psyche? Why would he not accept federalism as a solution when it would have been the strategic thing to do for him? Did he believe out of hubris he would win militarily?
I think for two main reasons. Look, he had in my view, kind of very narrow outlook of the world. He has spent nearly his entire life in northern Sri Lanka. He had been very little to the south of Sri Lanka. Yes, he had been a few years in India, but also in India, focusing on Sri Lanka, not on India. He didn't really understand India. He didn't understand the thinking in Delhi. He had not the slightest clue of the thinking in, say, Washington, which was the sole superpower of the time. So he struggled to understand both southern Sri Lanka and the Sinhala mentality, as well as India, the United States. So he had a very narrow worldview, and if you consider some of these most crazy mistakes, he killed Rajiv Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, who India had been the main supporter of the time. Before that, if you had a rebel movement in Mexico, would you start killing the President of the United States of America? Or would you give it another thought before you embark upon something like that? And this came, in my view, from his very narrow and very militaristic mindset, meaning that every issue called for a military solution. Balasingham, he got opening up to the world. Balasingham knew the word, and Balasingham can tell him you need to do this or that to understand the world better and to please the Americans or please the Indians or have some access to the hearts and minds of the Sinhalese, all this. But that was not the mindset of Prabhakaran. I will add one other factor, which is, if you look around the world today, look to Trump. Every person who speaks to Trump is trying to please him and flattering him. If you see a TV program from the government meetings in the United States, they all tell the greatest gift from the United States in world history, the best president ever. Yeah. Unfortunately, that also was the atmosphere around Prabhakaran.
Interesting.
Because look, he at least after the war started, I don't think he ever met a Sinhalese person.
Right.
He met once a Muslim delegation. He met a few foreigners, and I was the foreigner he met the most often. And then he met Tamils. But most of the Tamils who came to Prabhakaran came there to tell him, you are the greatest king of the Tamils, or the greatest leader that ever had. They were speaking to him very much as you see people today speak to Trump in Washington. If this kind of flattening mindset can happen in the most powerful nation in the world, the United States of America, because it could also happen in a small, much smaller entity in northern Sri Lanka. And when you get flattening all the time, you may not be able to really reflect on the big picture. So the narrow mindset and the flattening, I think, were the two at the end of the day, which also at the end of the day undid Prabhakaran. He was killed, his entire family was wiped out. So if he had followed Bala Singh's much more objective views, his wisdom, it would have been very different.
You know, it's very interesting that India has come up multiple times, right? At one point you said, oh, we also had to please India because they were one of the stakeholders in this larger discussion. And we know now that India was secretly involved in this peace process at every step. If I'm correct, you were meeting with raw officials at the New Delhi airport. Indian intelligence actually had a secret meeting with the LTTE right before the ceasefire was signed. Yet, the public position of India was that they were keeping an arm's length. So, I mean, in the larger context of today's world, what does that reveal about the greater powers and how they operate in small regional conflicts like ours? I mean, that's covert diplomacy, right? But how is our public, the Sri Lankan public, supposed to be okay with that, with a different country having a say in what happens here?
Secretly.
I take a very positive view of the Indian involvement in the peace process. They were always supportive. They supported peace and they didn't see any military solution, so they should get credit for that. At that time, there were only two foreign powers which mattered in Sri Lanka: United States of America, the dominant power in the world, the one and only superpower, and India, the big regional neighbor. China didn't matter at that time. Now China matters a lot. I mean, if you go to the new roads in Colombo, built by China, if you see some of the ports in Hambantota and Colombo, they're built by China. Now China matters. At that time, and it didn't matter. It was all about India and the United States. Both India and the United States supported the peace process. They didn't want the LTTE to succeed in carving out a separate state. They were adamantly against that, but they wanted a peaceful settlement which can close down the conflict. So yes, it's true that India was active behind the scenes, but they were constantly supporting the peace process. And my view is, I mean, I see many people in Sri Lanka who think India is behind everything in the world. I think Sri Lanka should get out of that mindset. I mean, Sri Lanka has, frankly, only one neighbor, only one neighbor. I mean, you can take your girlfriend on a boat from Mannar to India for the night and go to a cinema and go back on the same night. It's so close. India is so big. In Sri Lanka has so much to benefit from a good relationship to India in economic terms. Because I'm a foreigner, but I think the long-term aim should be a bridge to India. If there's a bridge to India, you earn Chinese high-speed rail. You can go from Colombo to Chennai in 3 hours by high-speed rail. So that integration will help Sri Lanka economically. But that's of course my view. I know many Sri Lankans have a different take.
Yeah, no, I think they completely agree that we need India as an ally. I think most of our previous guests have also highlighted that, especially geographically. I think there's much we can benefit from a very strong India-Sri Lanka relationship. But just to go back to the war.
Look, I mean, just to understand the difference. When I watch the two of you on these TVs, you can both be Indian. You can not be Chinese. No one can think you were Chinese. I mean, you look Indian. Because there is no, I mean, Indian and Chinese, Indian and Sri Lankan look the same, basically eat the same food, you have the same religion in the sense that Buddhism and Hinduism is so closely related. Sinhala language is closely related to Hindi language.
Yeah, Sanskrit.
Go on and go on. I mean, Sri Lankans and Indians are sisters and brothers in the way Sri Lankans can never be with, say, Americans or Europeans or Chinese.
Yeah. But, I mean, when you were balancing the stakeholders, I mean, India, like you said, has a very deeply complex history, right, of its own, and also with Sri Lanka. Raw supported the Tamil Tigers in the 1980s, but then when the LTTE killed Rajiv Gandhi, they completely changed their position. So by the time Norway got involved, India's position was, okay, no breaking up of Sri Lanka, no major Western power getting sucked in, keep us informed, but not visible. So how did you balance those conflicting positions?
During that time, I went to Delhi maybe every 6 weeks or so to keep the Indians informed, but also to get information from India. Like, I mean, Indian intelligence, of course, had much better view on, say, the military situation in the island than I could ever have, because they had a huge number of connections. They had satellite photos and others, so that was not so important at that time, but they had a lot of information, so I could get their take on the situation, and I informed about what happened between the LTTE and the government, because India didn't want to have any direct links to the Tigers. To what extent they were indirect and that there was no kind of meeting between top Indian officials and Mr. Prabhakaran, as far as I'm aware of them. They wanted to avoid that after the killing of Rajiv Gandhi. Go back to the 1980s, and it's a very different story. I mean, the LTTE was allowed to train in Tamil Nadu, so were the other Tamil militant groups. There was financial support from NGR, who was then the chief minister of Tamil Nadu. And this even started back in the days when Indira Gandhi was very irritated with President Jayawardeneh of Sri Lanka, because she felt that Jayawardeneh was too close to the Americans, setting up American radio stations in Sri Lanka, and many other things she didn't like. She had no idea to help the Tamil Tigers to win power in Sri Lanka, but she saw the Tamil Tigers as a tool, and the other Tamil militant groups, to keep President Jayawardeneh in check. That's how it started. That's how I see it.
Interesting. Because that is a question most Sri Lankans ask, of why India would have supported them in the first place. And so they were hedging and trying to put leverage on Colombo, using the LTTE at some point.
Look, there are two very interesting parallel processes here, which both led to the killings of top Indian leader. One was Sri Lanka, and the other was the militants in Punjab. When Indira Gandhi started supporting the Tamil militants, not to make a Tamil separate state, because India was adamantly against that, but to create difficulties for Mr. Jayawardeneh, so that he would come to a more pro-Indian, less pro-American position in the early 1980s. Very similarly in Punjab, the Congress party had a Sikh competitor, and to undermine the Sikh competitor, Indira Gandhi started to support the Sikh militants, which ended up in the complete destruction of the golden temple of the Sikh Amritsar. The Sikh process ended in Sikh extremists killing Indira Gandhi herself, and the Sri Lankan process ended with the LTTE killing Rajiv Gandhi, her son. So this kind of playing with foreign or domestic conflicts came back to the Nehru Gandhi family in a very violent manner. So if it's a lesson learned, is that big power should be very cautious in playing politics with other conflicts. And that message should be sent to the United States at the moment, but to now the big power, please be very cautious in what you involve yourself in.
We will come to that actually, about great powers and how they go around. But can you explain to me what Colonel Karuna's role is in this? The mainstream view is that his defection is what changed the tide in the war and led to victory for the Sri Lankan government. So who was he and what role did he play?
Karuna had a unique position in the LTTE at the time. He was the one and only LTTE commander. He was both the military and political commander in his district, which was Batticaloa or the East. And he was also, I think, the one and only LTTE top-level commander who originated from the East, as different from Jaffna. So he had a very strong position, and he was part of the negotiating team. So I met him many times in Thailand and many other places. He was in a way very charismatic, I would say. He was a very charismatic personality. He is also accused of war crimes, killing many Muslim policemen. I cannot go into whether or not that is true, but that is the accusation against him, that he had been a very brutal leader. Then he broke with Prabhakaran in 2004, and I agree that was a tipping point for everything, because he drastically reduced LTT's power in the east. Up to that point, of course, LTT had been strong both in the north and the east, and from then onwards it was strong only in the north. And it also provided over time the Sri Lankan government with a unique source of knowledge and network in the thermal militant groups. Of course, Karuna had been part of everything, knew everything, knew Prabhakaran better than anyone, or at least nearly anyone.
Yeah.
So he was a unique source of knowledge for Sri Lankan intelligence. And of course, a number of the Karuna soldiers also became paramilitary groups, killing off LTT or related or Tamils who were on the LTT side. So he had massive impact on everything happening after that.
I take it that you've met Colonel Karuna?
Oh yeah, many times, for sure.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
So what?
As I said, he was a kind of charismatic politician, and of course he was never up for election in the LTT. But he was the type of politician you would think you would see, say, in the House of Representatives in the United States. I mean, charismatic and looking for favors.
So after his defection, the consensus by even the great powers was that, all right, let's do this militarily. Because what, did they give up on the peace process? Because they thought there's no negotiating with Prabhakaran anymore, and even the defections caused that thinking?
Not ultimately, I think. I mean, there were many different things happening at the same time. Karuna's defection, there was new elections in Sri Lanka, which shifted the power from Erik Solheim to Shalika Kumaratunga. I mean, she was all through the president, and now also her party got the power in the parliament. LTT gradually started considering going back to war. Peace negotiations stopped, but at this point, everyone forgot and hoped that we would come back to the peace process. The last chance for peace, in my view, that was the tsunami, but that is in December 2004, where, as you know, I mean, 35,000 Sri Lankans died. It was a horrible tragedy for the land. That immediately had a very positive impact on the peace process, because the LTT military forces also helped Sinhalese civilians, Sri Lankan army, Tamilians who they would know were on the LTT side. So there was a kind of moment on national reconciliation facing these enormous forces of nature. And for this half year, we were negotiating a relief mechanism which would help us, the Sinhala South and the Muslim East and the North. But ultimately, these dragged on and came bogged down in bureaucracy, and then it was basically shut down by the Supreme Court. That has been successful. I mean, if Sri Lankan leaders had acted decisively in January, February 2005, I'm sure the peace process at that time would have come back on track. What effects of that, no one can know. But please also recall that the election in Sri Lanka in December 2005, Ranil Wickremesinghe lost to Mahinda Rajapaksa with something like 49.5 to 50.5. It was the closest fought election ever. If the LTT had not stopped panels voting, everyone knows that those tablets would have voted for Ranil, so he would have won the election. So it was a very, very close election with an outcome at the end of the day decided by Prabhakaran, which could have put everything on another trajectory. People tend to believe that everything is fixed in history, and now we know the outcome, but at that time it was not fixed. The tsunami could have given another outcome, and the election could have given another outcome.
What was the LTT's line of strategic thinking to make them boycott the elections and taking Mahinda's side, when for them it would have been strategically beneficial to allow Ranil to come in and negotiate with him, right? What was their thinking there?
Ballasinghe was very opposed to this. He thought the LTT should allow everyone to vote with the new getting Ranil Wickremesinghe elected, while Prabhakaran had the opposite view. I can't be exactly sure, but I think the reason in Prabhakaran's thinking was that Ranil Wickremesinghe at the time spoke a lot about the so-called international safety net, which was that Southern Sri Lanka or Sri Lankan state could negotiate with the LTT with confidence, because at the end of the day, yes, India, United States, and European Union, other foreign powers would support them and give them the economic and political safety net, which at the time Mahinda Rajapaksa did not have. So I think President Prabhakaran didn't want to be involved with this safety net, and for that reason he preferred Mahinda. He may not have understood Mahinda's capacities. Look, at the time, Mahinda had been Minister of Fisheries, Minister of Labour, yes, maybe for a short period Prime Minister. No one could know that he would be such a strong war leader for a number of years. So Prabhakaran, I think, drastically underestimated Mahinda, and he didn't want this safety net. That's my view, but of course I haven't discussed this with Prabhakaran, so I can't be absolutely sure.
Right. Okay. I mean, if you're okay with it, I'd actually like to deconstruct your core doctrine, right, on peace. Because, again, if I'm not mistaken, in Jan 2026, you actually did an interview with The Guardian, and you said that nearly always it's a peace process of some sort. Nearly always it's messy. The test is not whether it's perfect, it's whether it ends the killing. Now, I know you've taken multiple stances on various regional conflicts. I think in Afghanistan, you've publicly said that the Taliban rule is better than the endless war. In Gaza, you've said that Israel cannot kill all Palestinians and that war will eventually end on negotiated terms. In Ukraine, you've said that Russia cannot achieve a stable total victory, but also that Ukraine cannot fully recover its 2014 borders, at least not through force. And in Sudan, you've said that a messy negotiated division is the most realistic path. What does messy really mean? And I'd also love to kind of apply your doctrine to the most talked about conflict of today, which is the US-Iran war.
This is an absolute excellent question, and it's so important. Look, there are a few wars in human history which could only end with a total victory for one side. I mean, a compromise with Adolf Hitler, who wanted to kill all Jews and wanted to kill basically all Poles and Ukrainians and many Russians, was it was impossible. So he needed to be defeated. I also think that the compromise in the American Civil War, which was about slavery or not slavery, was impossible because, as Lincoln said, the United States cannot continue half slave, half free. So there are some such wars, but nearly all wars in history are of a different nature. You end up with a compromise, which doesn't give a total victory to one side. It may give sometimes more to one side than to the other, but normally it's more even. And that compromise is very rarely to the satisfaction of everyone. In Sri Lanka, there was absolutely no compromise which had been satisfying to everyone. A compromise would have had to be in some sort of federalism, with Prabhakaran and the LTTE in some sort of power position in the north. LTTE would not have got a separate state, which they desired, so many Tamils would have been disappointed. But also many Singhala would say this is too much power to the Tamils. We don't like Prabhakaran, and he's still in some power position. So it was a bit a messy compromise, and Muslims may also complain. But still, it would have been a compromise which has saved the life of tens of thousands of people who are now dead. If you look at nearly all other wars, you can find similar compromises. I mean, there is no way Israel can kill all Palestinians. I mean, I don't know how many there are, 6, 7 million. You cannot kill them all. They will all be there. Well, a compromise is needed. And nor can the Palestinians wipe out the Jewish state and get all Jews out of the Middle East. And you can go on. Between Iran and the United States, well, as it stands now, Iran is in a much stronger position than they were a few months back, and they're much weaker militarily because so much of their military force has been destroyed. But they showed to the world that, they just need a small, medium-sized drone program to keep the Hormuz Strait closed. Any nation in the world can make a drone program. Sri Lanka can also make a drone program. In Sri Lanka, with a nation of 22 million people, could have closed and there's 90 million Iranians, could have closed the Hormuz Strait with a drone program. Well, then you need a compromise. It should have to be some guarantees against nuclear weapons in Iran. but also some guarantees against continuous American and Israeli attacks on Iran. That compromise, again, will not satisfy everyone. There will for sure be militant people in Iran who don't like it. There will be so-called Iran folks in the United States or Israel who don't like it. But it's much, much better than war. And Afghanistan may be the clearest of all examples. Who loves the Taliban? I don't, and I'm sure you don't either. I mean, they even keep young girls outside education. They will keep they will keep Afghanistan in continuous poverty. Iran is now the poorest nation in Asia, and it will remain so if we keep all girls and women outside the workforce. I mean, you will remain very poor. But the United States could not defeat Taliban. They tried for 20 years with the most sophisticated military force in the world. Still, they couldn't do it. Well, then maybe it's better to call close and find them as a compromise, and then hopefully over time working with Taliban, and I'm sure there will be forces in Afghanistan also who will understand that this is wrong. There are indications that the Taliban, there are different opinions within Taliban, then they must come back to a modern world and not remain in this craziness of suppression of women.
Okay. And when you do mediate, I think something we've found out about you is that you've coined the term elephant theory. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but the theory is that if you see an elephant, believe it's an elephant. Now, of course, in the context of our civil war, obviously both sides lied to you constantly about the killings that they were very much responsible for. As mediators, because I'm a mediator myself, how do you maintain your integrity when both parties are lying to your face? And how does that theory hold up when the elephant is a war crime? How do you deal with that?
The elephant theory was that when you see an elephant, please believe it's an elephant. If someone comes and tells you this is a giraffe or a zebra or something else, no, it's an elephant. You see an elephant, it's an elephant. In the peace process in Sri Lanka, for example, when Nilan Tirushelvan was killed, it was to me absolutely clear this was done by the LTTE. But the LTTE would claim no, it was not us, it was done by some other forces to blame this on the LTTE. They basically say it was the government who did it, to blame it on the LTTE. When, say, Joseph Parajasingam, who was a Tamil parliamentarian, was killed in the Batikalwa church on the Christmas day, obviously by some paramilitary groups under the government, maybe under Karuna. It was obviously the government who did it because it was a strong spokesman for Tamil interest. But then the government was, oh no, it was not us, it was the LTTE who did it to blame us. Both were of course not true. Government killed Joseph Parajasingam and the LTTE killed Nilan Tirushelvan, both two persons I knew very, very well. I can go on with all these examples. Of course, sometimes they were lying. They were lying to us. They will know that they were lying, and they will know that we will know that they were lying. when people from LTTE told us that no, we had nothing to do with the killing of Lakshman Kadigamar or Nilan Tirushelvan, of course they knew that they could never convince us at 1 second. But still they needed to keep up this
the act.
This facade, this act, exactly. So how to handle that? I mean, my way of handling it was, look, what would the victims of this war do? So this war are Sinhalese mothers in Gaul and Maltare who see their sons being killed up in the north, and that Tamil women in the north seeing their sons and daughters or themselves being killed up there. They are the victims of this war. They have not caused this war, but they're victims of this war. What would they want us to do? And also they always want us to continue to try to find a peaceful settlement. So that was kind of gave us the energy to continue, even when you met people who lied to you and you knew that they were lying.
Okay, but I mean...
And in the case of Nilan Tirushelvan, we had one very great benefit to the LTTE, and that was Bala Singha never lied to me. So he would tell me, yes, look, Erik, this was done by the LTTE for this or that reason.
Okay.
So that gave a great insight as to what happened, even if other entity official spokespersons in public will tell us none of it. This was not us, this was the government.
Sure, but I mean, I don't know. To me, I don't think I could ever do what you do. I think it's very impressive because it's a lot to carry, right? And I think one of the most personal parts about your story with Sri Lanka is that on Norwegian Independence Day, actually, in 2009, you received a call from LTTE's Peace Secretary Chief, and he said that he wanted to surrender with Nadesan, and he asked for your help. If I'm right, you told him it was too late, and the next day they were dead, allegedly shot while they were walking towards the Sri Lankan army lines, carrying a white flag because they were given the assurance of a safe passage. I mean, you've spent hundreds of hours with these people, you knew their families. How do you carry something like that and move on, or do you not at all?
No, I mean, of course, it was very, very emotional when so many people you knew very well was killed on both sides. I mean, I knew Lakshman Kadigamar also very, very well, so both on the government side and on the LTT side. Great people were killed and in brutal ways. In the case of the LTT, they were all, at the end of the war, there were also obvious war crimes. The son of Prabhakaran was 12 years old. We have photos of him with Sinhalese soldiers. He got sweets from the Sinhalese soldiers, and later he was bumped off. That's a war crime. Because, I mean, there is no excuse for killing a 12-year-old when he's taken into your custody. He cannot be blamed for his father's misdeeds. Even if you hate Prabhakaran, you protect his son. But what is a bit rare with the end of the Sri Lankan war is that we don't know exactly what happened to the top leaders. We still do not know exactly what happened to Polideva and Nadesan, even Prabhakaran or Botto Aman or the top leaders, whether they were killed in action, whether they were taken into custody by the Sri Lankan army and then killed off, we don't know. What we do know is that they're all dead, but exactly what happened, we do not know. That is quite rare, because if you look at other wars in the world, normally, you know. My hope is that look, for all these actions, there are witnesses. However, these witnesses will all be Sinhalese. There are no Tamils who witnessed this, which are still alive. So the witnesses are Sinhalese soldiers who must have been witnessing what happened to Prabhakaran, because there are always people there, either generals, but also privates or normal soldiers. My hope is that at some point they will feel the duty to speak out, to explain what happened. At this time, it has been no incentive for anyone to speak out. You can be considered a traitor by other Sinhalese if you speak out. You may have been involved in something, so you will be called a war criminal by the Tamil diaspora. So there's no incentive for people to speak out. But if we can create a situation where people can feel confident to speak out, at least we can get to know what happened. And particularly for Tamils who don't know what happened to their loved ones, I think that will give some consolation. I mean, like, assume you're a Tamil woman, her husband disappeared or your son disappeared during the end of the war. Of course, the chance that they are still alive is 0.01. I mean, for sure they are dead. But you cannot be absolutely sure. If anyone knocks at your door at night, you may still think, oh, maybe, can it be my husband? It's a miracle coming back. So getting the closure, getting to know exactly what happened, I think will give consolation to many people. But only the Sinhala soldiers who were witnessing this, or Sinhala military leaders, colonels, generals who were there, only they can clarify, because only they can bear witness. But up to this point, very few, if any, has come forward, because there have been no incentive to do it.
So you speak of the individual person and the human elements. When you negotiate with people in power who are involved with each other in particular, do you find that their sense of the world is very macro and that they have very little empathy for the human individual that they are affecting and impacting? Has that been your experience? How do you contend with that?
I think this is, there's no one rule for this. I mean, you can find war leaders with not the slightest empathy for those killed in the conflict, but you can also find historical leaders with a lot of empathy. One of my favorite politicians, Abraham Lincoln, who led the most bloody war in American history, had a lot of empathy for his soldiers and for also even for the people in the South which was killed in this war. And you can find war leaders with that empathy. And you can also find war leaders with the wisdom to stop. Look what happened with India and Prime Minister Modi with the so-called Operation Sindoor in Pakistan, or at least forces in Pakistan, have caused a horrible terrorist attack against India. Nearly 30 Hindus, not Muslims, but only Hindus, were killed in that horrible attack. And Modi responded, yes, with destroying some infrastructure in Pakistan, but then called a stop. No endless war, no forever war, as the United States has made so time. A short war, then stop. That wisdom war leaders should have, and if they consider the enormous suffering of the people, very often their own people, they may do it better. But because very often war leaders are so far removed from the consequences of the war, they sometimes are sitting in the greatest of luxury, at least very often, at least in safety, and calling the murder of people which they would never see, they would never meet the family. So that distance is unfortunately driving many wars.
How do you deal with a leader like that when you're trying to mediate or negotiate?
Again, you must then always look for where are the possibilities for ending this war, because that's what the victims would want you to do. Where is the compromise which can satisfy that leader? What people tend to forget is that political leaders are normally trying to lead their nation or their group or the ethnic group or whatever, but they also have a lot of concern for themselves. Some people say that we should end the war in Ukraine by bringing Putin to a war crimes criminal court in Hague. Some people say that we should end the war between Israel and Gaza by bringing Mr. Netanyahu to a war crimes court in Hague. I have a lot of sympathy for that. But why will Putin or Netanyahu try to wind down the wars if the next step is that they will be brought to a criminal court and spend the rest of their life in prison? You need to find a solution which not only is good for Russia or Israel, but that also gives something to Putin and Netanyahu. Otherwise, they will never call for war. Exactly the same, of course, was the case in Sri Lanka. Again, the negotiated settlement over federal state at that time, I think 90% of Sri Lankans would have accepted. But it also needed to be acceptable to keep in power the top leaders in Colombo and keep in power Mr. Prabhakaran in some time of entity.
Okay. Just to bring...
Otherwise, they wouldn't go for peace.
Okay, yeah, that's a fair view. And I mean, just to bring this segment about the Sri Lankan war and mediation so that we can move on to the other questions we have for you. I mean, we've talked about Pakistan, and I think in the very beginning you told us that, Pakistan is doing a very commendable thing by mediating or stepping up to mediate the US-Iran war. But, I mean, if we take a look at how Norway inserted itself in our war as advocate for peace and mediation. I mean, Norway is a small state. It has zero strategic interest in this region, zero colonial history in South Asia, no stakes. And that's necessary for a mediator. You have to be neutral and impartial. But Pakistan definitely has stakes in the US and Iran war. I mean, there's so many that I could name. Is that ethical for them to do? How do you manage it when you have skin in the game?
Because the most important factor, the reason why Norway could play a role in Sri Lanka and Pakistan in this war, is that they are acceptable to the main parties. Pakistan has brought themselves, they have a historical, relatively close relationship to Iran trusts them, but particularly the chief of the army of Pakistan has created a very close personal relationship to Mr. Trump. Like it or not, but this is very, very useful. My Indian friends, of course, don't like it and hate it. Pakistan in general is close to Mr. Trump. But this has been very, very helpful for this particular war, because Pakistan, without this relationship, could never have asserted itself. But of course, Pakistan cannot do it alone, so that's why they relate to Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Oman. They have been very close to. They have a very close relationship to China, and China has also supported them throughout. So, for all these reasons, Pakistan could do it, even if they have a lot more interest. Norway was acceptable to the government of Sri Lanka and the Tamil Tigers, and very, very importantly to India, because we were far away, and we were Christians, not Hindu, not Buddhist. We didn't speak any other languages. We didn't even normally eat dosas or curries from, or idlis and curries from southern Sri Lanka. So yeah, the exact fact that we were far away was the reason why we could be accepted.
Could Sri Lanka?
India was very, very adamant. They could not accept any major power. Of course, not China or Japan or the United States, but not even like France or the United Kingdom, smaller powers. They would accept none of this. They would accept only a small nation, which they, at the end of the day, could not harm their interest.
Right.
And can Sri Lanka perhaps play that role in the future? Do you think we'd be good mediators for regional conflicts?
I think Sri Lanka has a lot to speak for itself. One of them is that it's a nation. There is no nation in the world that has anything against Sri Lanka. You are threatening no one. No one has an issue in Sri Lanka or hates Sri Lanka. I have a good positive, let's call it, image. And these things matters. I mean, if you have $1 million and I ask you, will you put it in a bank in Switzerland or will you put it in a bank in Nigeria? I mean, you immediately know the answer to this question, and this is not negative to my Nigerian friends, but you trust Switzerland on banking a lot more than Nigeria. So image matters, and Sri Lanka has a positive, good image. And the fact that it has been through a war is a plus, because it creates a certain amount of people with knowledge and understanding of conflict. So yes, I think Sri Lanka could take on that. Maybe the biggest caveat is that Sri Lanka has so strong domestic problems, in the sense that it needs to establish more economic growth, better prosperity, more jobs for young people. That any leader, when this AKD or whoever is the leader, will tend to have a domestic focus, because that's what really matters in Sri Lanka, is to bring Sri Lanka onwards. But that's except for that negative kind of domestic focus. I mean, Norway is so rich, so we could afford to focus on this. But except for that, I think Sri Lanka has a lot to speak for itself.
Yeah, you said that we don't have any external enemies, but I'll just add that we are our own worst enemy.
Yeah.
So there's that. We need a mediator for that against ourselves.
Yeah, I mean, you are acceptable to China, to India, to the United States, to everyone. If there were a conflict where you were called upon, and that's a big asset.
Fair enough. You've mentioned that when it comes to negotiations, is there a very big difference between how Western states mediate and negotiate compared to non-Western states? You've mentioned that when Western states negotiate or mediate, they add ideological preconditions based off their own experiences, and they try to impose that. And that is, from what I've learned from Sadia, that's a big no-no when it comes to mediation. So maybe could you speak about that? What do they get wrong?
There is a big difference in the thinking in the United States and Europe on one side, and in China and India on the other side. And this may come historically from religion. Christianity is a missionary religion. My grandmother would have thought that all Sri Lankans would have been very, very happy if they all become Christians, because then they will be saved, they will not go to hell, they will all go to paradise. So all Sri Lankans will be so happy if we can just bring Christianity and the word of Jesus Christ to Sri Lanka. That was the worldview of Europe for so long, and we took it not just from religion, but into promoting democracy, even with military means, and promoting what we call Western values, which tend to be very empty, but we had this missionary instinct. India has nothing of that. I mean, Hindu Dharma is not a missionary religion. I mean, India is very, very proud to be a Hindu state. that they don't want any Christian or anyone else to come in. China, and China is not a confusion. It's not a communism was a missionary thought in the past. They wanted to make an entire world communist. China's nothing of that. It's not a communist state. It's a Confucian state, and Confucianism, that's a historical ideology of China, but not with an aim of dominating the rest of the world. So I think this missionary finger-pointing attitude of the West versus the much less so in China and India in the 21st century is an enormous strength for China and India. And some Americans said that if China goes to a state in Africa, they will provide a railroad, and if the United States goes there, they will provide a lecture. And no one wants that lecture.
Right. Actually, one of our previous guests, who's a NATO consultant, told us that when China goes around the world, they look at what the people want and they give it to them. And when America goes around the world, they give us freedom when nobody's asked for it.
Oh, it's very, very well said. And this is also what the United States gets wrong. I mean, in Africa, every nation now trade more with China, except Lesotho, trade more with China than with the United States. And the United States constantly see this as a zero-sum game, as a competition. But if the United States want to have more power in Africa, they must give an offer. There's not one nation in Africa which is ideologically aligned with China. I mean, Sri Lanka is not ideologically aligned with China. But if China offer to build ports or roads or railroads, I mean, everyone will take that offer. If the United States can give a better offer, everyone will take the offer from the United States. Or they will look into how can we get an offer both from China and the United States because we want to be friendly to both of them. That's the attitude of basically every nation in the world. But the United States tend to have this very, very narrow zero-sum game that either us or them, rather than saying that everyone wants to get maximum. I mean, nearly all young people in the world will be very happy to study at Harvard or Yale, but also at Tsinghua or Georgetown, which are the top universities of China, because they are now maybe even better than American universities. But people want to be friendly to both China and the United States. Americans tend to not understand. But the core issue, which you asked about, I think is this missionary, ideologically finger-pointing, lecturing attitude of the West, while the much more softer attitude of both China and India.
So, just right before we move on, actually, you were the Deputy Secretary General at the UN and the head of UNEP. So, you've been very critical of the UN, and I'm also very critical of the UN. I think they're an absolutely useless organization, to be honest with you.
We disagree.
We disagree on that. So, what's your take on that? Do you feel like they do play an effective multilateral role, or really what do they do? They have processes, but do they have any mechanism for effective outcomes? I don't see that.
If you can mediate between the two of you, I have a little sympathy for both of you. I agree with you that UN is in the biggest crisis in its history. But also I agree with you that UN is the needed. The world cannot do without the UN. We must have a global organization which brings everyone together, and we have no better choice than the UN. But look, I mean, UN is now not effective in any of the major wars. There was no role for the UN in the peacemaking between the United States and Iran. It was all Pakistan and a few other support.
Exactly.
But Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan, Myanmar, UN is completely removed. That is because the organization was kind of frozen in its early days. The United Nations was formed by basically one man, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then President of the United States. Yep. And what he did at the time, in the midst of the brutal war against the Germans, against the Japanese, he brought together the best group of Americans, and they founded the World Bank, National Monetary Fund, which happens know very, very well.
Yep, very well.
Too well.
And the UN. And at the time, this was absolutely brilliant. But it was frozen. There was no new development. Look, India is not on the Security Council of the UN. It's a nation of 1.5 billion people, with the third largest economy in the world, much, much more powerful than any European nation. But the United Kingdom is there.
Yep.
Right? United Kingdom was so powerful in 1945.
Yeah.
Then India was a colony. Sri Lanka, by the way, also was a colony under the United Kingdom. Now it's just an island in Europe, because the United Kingdom can continue in the Security Council in India and Africa being outside. So the United Nations has not reformed itself. And at the current, it has the weakest leadership in the history of the United Nations. It's not visible anywhere. But all that can change. A new Secretary General will be elected this year. And hopefully that person, woman or man, can put the United Nations back into a more important position. We need to do that.
So are you optimistic about that? Because the way I see it, Erik, is that, like you said, the United States essentially created the United Nations and the IMF and the World Bank, creating a rules-based order, but that was just a mechanism for a more sophisticated form of control, really, globally, wasn't it? Rather than taking the British formula of, I'm going to go to a nation, put a gun to their head, and colonize them. This is a much more sophisticated manner. So, in that sense, why would any great power, from a realpolitik viewpoint, accept this? Like, can the United States, will they allow the UN to be a neutral arbiter?
I think the reason why powers should and will accept a rules-based order, not the old American rules-based order, but a new rules-based order, is that it's in the benefit of. No power is now strong enough to dominate the world. United States is not. I mean, China is stronger than the US in economic terms. Yes, United States is stronger than China in military terms. But none can dominate the world. And added to these two superpowers, India, Europe, Indonesia will be the fourth largest economy in the world by 2050. No one talks about Indonesia. You can go on Turkey, Nigeria, Brazil. There are so many other nations. They all want the same. Smaller nations like Sri Lanka. There are so many. So if there are no rules, it will be anarchy. Yes, it's true that if there are no rules, President Trump can do basically whatever he wants, but he cannot achieve whatever he wants. He can do it, but he cannot achieve it, because the American military power cannot, it could not, they're fighting Iran, and they basically lost, not in military terms, but in political terms.
Yeah.
Iran is stronger after the war.
Yeah.
Iran controls the Strait of Hormuz. No one thought of that before. And the United States in the last decades basically lost all the wars where they involved, in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and now with Iran. Why? Because there are so strong limits to what we can achieve with military means. And that's why even such a strong power that past the United States would, over time, I think, see benefits in some global rules. They may not respect them fully, but it's a difference between if you break the rules when some absolute core national interests are at stake, or if you make it a habit of breaking the rules all the time. China is at this current point very, very different, because China has seen its interest in this rules-based order, because the growth for China is mainly focused on the economy. China is now the main trade partner with nearly all nations in the entire world, including Sri Lanka. And China wants this order where they can continue to grow. That will make China more powerful. Some nations are a little bit reluctant to that, but it's an economic, not a military power.
Okay. We're talking about the United Nations, and Shanil mentioned that you were executive director of the UN Environment Program for 2 years. We're talking about the climate, we're talking about the UN, obviously we have to talk about the Paris Agreement. Now, Sri Lanka itself is a signatory. We ratified it, I believe, in 2016. But what a lot of people don't know is that military emissions is actually the only sector that was explicitly excluded from the Paris Agreement reporting requirements for each country. And if I understand correctly, that's a political decision. It's not really an oversight. The states just wanted freedom to fight without having climate accountability. Now we take the recent US-Israeli strikes on the oil facilities in Iran in March, and following that, there was toxic black rain caused by smoke and soot from all the burning fuel depots. the WHO issued severe warnings about the effects of that, not just for the climate, but also for the people. Now, you yourself have said that all wars lead to environmental destruction and human fatalities, and the reverse is also true. So could you tell us a bit more about this? What is your perspective on the link between war, climate, and what should be done about it?
Look, it's a great question. And I mean, obviously, wars create a lot of environment destruction as well as emissions as a trade. They also create a lot of distraction in the sense that leaders are completely focused on how to resolve this urgent war rather than on the long-term issues like, say, how to control artificial intelligence or how to make sure that the world is not heating. So wars are bad from all perspectives, except, and that is the paradox. Now, Donald J. Trump, you may have heard the name, he is speaking against windmills and solar panels. But he's the largest promoter of solar and wind energy in the world.
In the US, yeah.
Why? Because every nation in the world looks to the Strait of Hormuz and they're saying, oh, do we want to strategically be dependent on the Strait of Hormuz? Do we want to be dependent on volatile oil markets, which make fertilizer more expensive in Sri Lanka, which make it more expensive to go by bus from, say Colombo to Hambantota? Do we really want this, or do we want to be energy independent? And then every nation comes to the conclusion that the sun is Sri Lankan, the wind is Sri Lankan, the rivers in Sri Lanka are Sri Lankan. Then for every drop of oil you replace with solar or wind energy, well, Sri Lanka becomes more energy independent. This is exactly the view of Prime Minister Modi of India, to rapidly move into the renewables to make India energy independent. And the reason why China has been so much less affected by the war in Iran than any other major nations, that China has spent the last 10 years becoming energy independent. I mean, every bus in China now is electric, every scooter is electric, trucks are electric, 60% of all new cars are electric. Well, that brings drastically down the amount of oil you need to import, and it's fueled by sun, which is Chinese. So China is not 100% energy independent, but much more than any other major nation, and that's why they're so much successful, and every other nation understands the message. Thank you, Donald Trump. You told us that we need to be energy independent.
Interesting. So, so you were talking about the Chinese supply chain and how we want to become independent in terms of our energy away from fossil fuels in the United States, the Strait of Hormuz. Aren't we replacing dependency on one nation or source of energy just with another great power? China controls 90+% of the solar supply chain end to end, 94% of permanent magnet production. I can just keep going on and on about the monopoly that China holds in green energy infrastructure. And you are the president, the international president of the Green BRI initiative. So aren't we simply replacing one dependency with the Chinese dependency? And we know the Chinese Communist Party model is very up controlled, state controlled.
Very vertical.
Very vertical. So how do we contend with that then? We're just replacing one with another.
It's a great question, and it's a question raised by many people. My answer is twofold. First, it's not parallel. Because if say Sri Lanka has made a solar park, say made it by solar panels from Tongwei or Longi, which are the two largest solar companies in China, well, that park will last for the next 30 years. And they will constantly make energy for Sri Lanka for the next 30 years. Even if the Chinese leaders wanted to close it down, it cannot, because you have already bought the panels and installed the park, it cannot be closed down. The oil markets can be closed down in 1 second. I mean, if Iranians send a drone to a ship in the Hormuz Strait, it will close down completely in 1 second. No one will go there. So there's no way renewables, when installed, can be harmed in the same way. But it's true that China is also extremely dominant in the production, of course, of all these renewables. That's because China is so much more efficient. Go a lot around China, and very sorry to say for Sri Lanka, but as much for my nation, Norway or Europe, we are not even close to the number, for example, industrial robots or the efficiency of the Chinese economic system. Yes, you can understand that for Sri Lanka, which is a developing nation, but Germany and France, Europe are the most developed in the world. We are far away from being able to compete with China at this stage. So what is the way forward? In my view, it's to form many, many more joint ventures with China, because then you get investment, you get technology, and then after you got this investment and technology, you should aim at doing better, and maybe you can do more. I mean, Prime Minister Modi, for example, has the slogan "Make it in India." There's 1 million young Indians joining the labor market every month. They all want a job. They don't want to import from China for sure. They want jobs in India. But the only way India can really excel would be to bring in partnerships with Chinese companies who are far ahead on the technology, and then learn from the technology and then do better in the future. And again, even the most advanced nations in Europe have exactly the same challenge, because we are so far ahead and so far ahead behind. China is now 90%, I think, of all solar in the world, 70% of all batteries. The only competitor on batteries is South Korea. There's no others. There's not one battery factory in Europe. There's none in Sri Lanka either, but you would expect them to be in Europe. But they're not. If you buy a BMW, billion German car, well, the battery is from China. If you buy a Tesla, again, most likely the battery is again from China. The battery is 40% of the car. So is a Tesla an American car with a Chinese battery? Or is a Chinese battery with an American carrossery? So the world is much more complicated, but China has a very, very, very strong position. And no nation who wants to go green can avoid China, then it will be so much more costly.
So we're talking about China, and of course, yeah, I agree, they're a leader in the construction of energy infrastructure. If you take a look at the world right now, a lot of energy infrastructure has been destroyed. Right? You look at Ukraine, Gaza, Sudan. The reconstruction of these places will require, I'm sure, like hundreds of billions in energy infrastructure. Who's going to build it? Is it going to be China?
Yeah, I think China will play a key role in building it. Who will finance it is another matter. But if you want to be, for a moment, optimistic, nations can come successful out of even the most horrible wars. And of course, Japan and Germany became some of the most successful nations after the Second World War. Vietnam is now expected to have the highest growth of any nation in the world in the next 10 years. It's an amazing success story. I visited Vietnam just after the war, and the American war. It was the most dirt-poor place you could think of. People were struggling just to get enough rice to eat every day, to survive. I mean, there were hunger and poverty everywhere. There was nothing. Now, Vietnam, sorry for Sri Lanka, is much more developed than Sri Lanka. At that time, of course, Sri Lanka was much more developed than Vietnam. So it shows that you can come out of, with the right government, with the right ambitions, you can come out of even the most horrible wars in a positive way. But China is building, constructing much faster than any other nation. So I think they will be called upon for constructing in all these crisis areas. Back in 2010, the United States and China both decided to make high-speed rail. In these 15 years, China has made 50,000 kilometers of high-speed rail.
Wow.
That's like from Beijing to Paris 3 times, back and forth. And while the United States have made exactly 0, not 1 kilometer of high-speed rail. Not because they don't have the engineers or the money, but they simply don't have the political system which get it done.
Like us.
Like us, pretty much.
Yep.
I actually want to kind of push you on this, Erik, is Deng Xiaoping, China's previous president, said that in 1992 actually, that the Middle East has oil and China has rare earths. And I think this part of the green transition conversation is often overlooked, where we don't understand the importance of rare earths and minerals and metals that come into this. From what I understand, China has been in this mindset for decades, and they've been preparing since the 80s actually, to create a complete monopoly in the rare earths and mineral sector, which they've done. Today they have 90% of all processing. As you know, Chinese companies are allowed to compete, but because of limited resources in China, now they compete outside of China. So they go to Argentina, Peru, Australia, buy up mines and so on and so forth. Given that's the case, in April 2025, they imposed export controls on these rare earths. The batteries that we use require these rare earths and cobalt and so on and so forth. The laptop, any electrical item you can think of. So when they imposed these export controls, the US auto industry kind of went to a halt. EU Automotive Association had they were having huge problems. Japan, same thing. So China can just switch off the tap at any point to anyone that disagrees with them, right? What's your whole take on this?
It's true that China has come into a very strong economic power position, which I'm sure they will use if there are major conflicts. You've seen it used against Japan, because of course there is a lot of controversies between China and Japan. But it is not actually used often because it's also hitting China. If there is less trade, China is the big trading nation of the world, the big exporter of the world, have a skyrocketing trade surplus,
right.
And they want to keep this. They cannot keep any of these if they deny other nations opportunities to trade. So I don't think it will be used often, but I think you're right, it may be used strategically when there are core conflict between China and some nations. But in my view is the following: if the rest of the world want to compete with China, which we all know, all do, I mean, India, South Asia want to compete, Europe want to compete, we must have a much more long-term strategic view. As an example, I mean, most batteries now are lithium-based. But how long will that last? Quite a few of the top Chinese companies are now making sodium batteries. I mean, they become much faster for scooters and then later for more heavy vehicles. Sodium, which is salt, is everywhere. It's all over the world. So there can be no monopoly on sodium. But of course, China can make the technology so much faster that they will compete better. And so how long these rare earth monopolies will last, it depends on technological development, which we cannot predict. But what's for sure is that if other nations are constantly over time much less efficient than China, we will lose out in competition and technology. And then China will also be able to make new monopolies of this type because technology develops. So the issue for us is what is the strength of China and how can we learn? And in my view, the strength of China is that they have a very strong government which set the direction, give the kind of overall direction for the nation. They have a very strong, vibrant competition in between Chinese companies. And of course, the benefit from the huge market. I mean, only India has a similar huge market. I mean, Sri Lanka has a market of 22 million people. Well, that's like a small to medium-sized profits of China, while China has a market of 1.4 billion. So if you're successful in that market, you tend to be very, very competitive. And China has a highly educated working class, which most other nations lack. I mean, many other nations have good universities and top leaders, but they don't have this vibrant, strong working class. So China have a few advantages which we can learn from. No nation in the world can copy the Chinese system. That's 3,000 years old. Sri Lanka cannot copy, even if Sri Lankan wanted to, say AKD wanted to be a true Chinese style leader, he cannot copy the Chinese. No. There's no way they can be imported to Sri Lanka because the historical context is completely different. But you can learn from China. And the most important is a strong government and vibrant competition in business.
Yeah, actually, because you said Modi's Made in India initiative, right? I find that to be, correct me if I'm wrong, I find that to be a bit of a fallacy because, again, according to the IEEA, they stated that the world will almost completely rely on China for the supply of key building blocks for solar panel production. So India is trying very hard in that. But as where we currently stand, they're just going to get locked into the solar hardware of Chinese parts, software advances, contracts, even the personnel, the skilled personnel. So within 20 to 35 years, they are completely dependent on their so-called adversary for their green energy. How could India even begin to go about it like this, or any other nation for that matter? So the way I see it, China in 30 years will have absolute control over energy infrastructure globally. Am I right in that?
I think India and other nations can learn from China in the following sense. I visited Seattle. Seattle is the largest battery factory in the world, and the Tesla or BMW batteries are most likely from Seattle. But what the Seattle people told me was that our success is thanks to BMW, the German car maker. Why is that? They said because BMW was our big customer, was a very demanding customer, because they could only have the best batteries. They could have a second-rate battery in a BMW, then the car will not sell.
Yeah.
They taught us business practice, they taught us economics. We learned so much from the BMW. Now Seattle is far advanced to BMW. It's there. BMW is not able to make the same batteries. But that thinking, you need, India or Europe need to bring in Chinese companies, because at least historical time, they have the best business practice and the best technology. But Indians are on average as smart as the Chinese. I'm a great admirer of China, but I don't think Europeans are inferior to the Chinese. They're also smart. So if they could do it, we can learn from them, and then maybe do better in the future.
So what exactly is the difference that you've seen between the Western thinking of this and the Chinese model and thinking? From my understanding, China today has 75% of all global clean energy patent applications, and just 25 years ago, in the year 2000, it was 5%. Now, that is a miraculous jump. That's absolutely miraculous. How did this come to be? And since you've been on both sides, both models of it, how did this come? What's the difference?
I think, and my American friends may not want to hear this, but I think the main difference is that the Chinese political system has been completely focused on the economic and technological uplifting of China. That has been the main aim. They have not involved in any war for the last 57 years. Wars, as I said, are very destructive, very demanding of time and energy. There's one issue in China, that is, how shall we be the strongest, richest, most economically developed nation in the world? We were far behind. We will want to come forward. The uplifting of China. That has been, and it's not focused on military, but focused on economics and technology. They have just developed a new 5-year plan. The key word is new high-quality productive forces. That's about artificial intelligence and digital revolution, and it's about the green technology, electric car, solar panel revolution, and how China can create jobs and prosperity based on this. Switch on to the United States. What has been the agenda of President Trump for the last year? Venezuela, Greenland, Iran. None of these issues are of core interest to his voters. People in Michigan and Missouri and Oklahoma couldn't give a damn for Greenland or Venezuela or even Iran. What do they want? They want better jobs, better roles, more high-quality education for the children, better healthcare in Oklahoma and in Michigan. And the President of the United States is not focused on that. Switch on to his predecessor, Mr. Biden. Mr. Biden even he spoke as if he was the president of Gaza and the president of Ukraine, not the president of Texas and Oklahoma.
Yep.
That's such a massive difference to China. But again, the total focus is the uplifting of China in the world, which, yes, will make China much more powerful for sure. But the most important is to create better jobs, more prosperity, more modern China. If the West cannot get leaders who have this long-term view on the uplifting of their nation, they will lose. In Europe, they're changing prime minister every day.
Yeah.
And how many prime ministers have there been in France for the last few years?
Yeah.
Mr.
In the
Starmer
UK.
is now elected. Yeah, exactly. Most people don't think he will survive this year.
Yep.
When you are completely enmeshed in domestic problems, you don't really take the view of what are the long-term interests of your nation. So China has a much stronger state, a much more long-term vision. They can bring also academic institutions, universities into this in the way we can do in the West. There are more Chinese students now getting exams in mathematics and physics and chemistry and these natural science.
STEM.
Then they're all STEM, exactly. I try to avoid the acronym, but that's right. The STEM, exactly right. The STEM subject. Then all students finishing exams in every topic in the United States. And quite a few of the Americans are studying law or political science and not more. So it gives such an enormous strength to the Chinese business because at the end of the day, business tend to be run by engineers, not by political scientists.
Correct. So, okay, then if we take Sri Lanka, we take China, we take green investment. Obviously, Sri Lanka wants Chinese green investment, especially after the economic collapse in 2022. So President AKD is trying to negotiate green investment from China. But we don't have rare earths, or at least we don't leverage our resources. We don't have a large market. We have an existing equity loss at Hambantota, an IMF program, dependency on India. So if you were to advise President AKD on how to negotiate something like this, what would you tell him?
First of all, on the foreign policy, to make sure to always balance China and India, to be friendly to both of them, but consider those the two most important. They are more important for Sri Lanka than the West. I mean, the West is far away and cannot at this stage really do much for Sri Lanka. So India and China is by far the most important. Then I would think you should invite as many investments from both China and India. I mean, there may be controversies against on, say, Mr. Adani's investment. But Adani does an enormous amount of green investments in India, which are fantastic. Why not invite him to do something good in Sri Lanka also because he can deliver. But of course, tell him to employ Sri Lankan staff, make sure that as many Sri Lankans are trained for this program as possible. And the same with Chinese. If they can build beautiful roads in Sri Lanka, but bring in as many Sri Lankans in that construction as possible so that they learn from it. So my view is Sri Lanka will do well with more foreign investments, but China and India are the two most likely sources of that foreign investment.
One of the criticisms, Erik, especially in Sri Lanka when it comes to the BRI, is that the Chinese investment in the BRI is actually not creating local employment and is not bringing a return of investment that materially trickles down to everyday people who just want to care about their own lives, right? Is there a risk that will happen even when we go into negotiations for the green investment? How do you avoid that?
Yeah, when I speak to Chinese business leaders, they will often tell me that we are so much more efficient in China that the best we can do is just to produce in China and sell to the world. We are much more efficient than Sri Lanka or India or Germany or France or the United States and all else. Let us produce in China and sell. I tell them, no, that can never work. Because Sri Lanka doesn't want jobs in Sichuan. Sri Lanka wants jobs in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
India doesn't want jobs in Guangdong. India wants jobs in India. You must invest in other places. But of course, Sri Lankan government should put itself in the driving seat. They are the bosses in Sri Lanka, and they should put demands to Chinese companies to make sure that when they invest, they use Sri Lankan staff. There are as many benefits for the local people as possible. Roads may not benefit people immediately, but roads tend to over time be very, very, very important for economic uplifting. I mean, in China, there is an old saying that if you want to go rich, the first you should do is to build a road. Because if there is no road, you cannot sell your local products. and you cannot, you will remain in poverty. So I think while people may not immediately feel the benefits of roads are beneficial and will make Sri Lanka over time more economically viable. But negotiate with the Chinese, negotiate with the Indians, still put up demands. They will understand that. I mean, they have a strong government themselves. They respect all other governments.
Let's hope the president watches this episode then.
I want to put a hypothesis to you and see what you think about this. You were talking about Venezuela and Iran, and many analysts believe that part of that is a long-term strategy of the US to strengthen their petrodollar. And as we know, the petrodollar is what gives the American empire much of its power in the world, their currency, right? And that is based off the petrodollar. China knows this. Since China does want to challenge the world superpower, the way I see it is that this green energy transition is one of the best ways for them to do that. President Trump has completely abandoned climate leadership, completely, right? And he's completely gone in on fossil fuels. But what do you think of the electro-yuan concept, where if the next century's energy infrastructure is solar farms, EV networks, so on and so forth, built by Chinese hardware, Chinese financing, maintained by Chinese personnel, then that mechanism is very identical to the petrodollar, because you're just replacing that with the green infrastructure that requires China. From your conversations with the Chinese, is this part of their long-term strategy to replace the petrodollar using green energy?
I have never heard anyone in China making that exact connection. But for sure, the long-term view of China is to replace dollar as the global currency with the yuan, or with that broader spectrum of different currencies. We may include the euro, include the Indian rupee and others. Because they believe that the United States dominance is very much linked to dollar, and they will want to replace it. This cannot happen in the short run, but over time it may happen. Mr. Trump's view on petrostate, in my view, that is like the people in, say, 1900 who said, oh, we are the #1 horse breeding nation in the world. We have many more horses than any other nation. We are the future. There was even a guy called Mr. Duncan. He was running in the 1890s a company in Detroit, in Michigan, which was focused on making horse carriages. And he didn't believe in the future. He thought the future will be the horse and horse carriage. Then someone came and told him, maybe you're on the wrong path, Mr. Duncan. And then all of a sudden it changed. And he became the founding father of General Motors, which for 100 years was the most important car company in the entire world. Now maybe Toyota is bigger and soon BYD will be bigger, but for 100 years General Motors was the #1 company in the world. But he had been so close to his horses until he understood the future. And Trump is like when he was with the horses. The future is not the petrol. And look, none of the top industrial leaders in the United States believe that the future is the petrol. I mean, Elon Musk or Jensen Huang from media, they both have told him that no, China may dominate artificial intelligence because they make the electricity right. And Apple and Amazon and Microsoft, none of these companies believe in going back to the petrol time. And most incredibly, 99% of all new electricity in the United States itself this year expected to come from solar and wind. Trump cannot turn the clock back to the time of horse, even if he wants to, even if he's powerful. And he cannot turn the time back to coal and oil because the investors don't believe in it.
From a practical standpoint, if you are the second power and you want to outdo the current superpower, and currency is one of the most important ways to do that, isn't this green energy transition mechanism the most effective way? I can't think of any other way they could possibly change the reserve currency unless they have a kinetic war with each other and one side loses terribly, which is horrible for the global economy. So,
No, I mean, Chinese are smart, but they are not all geniuses. So also in China, there is an element of learning. I think that the green transition in China started with pollution. People were so sort of fucking tired of the pollution in Beijing and all
Right.
these cities. I mean, they told me, I don't want to, I mean, I'm happy with economic development, but I don't want to live in this hell of pollution. That was what people said. Then that message was understood by the top leaders, President Xi Jinping and others, and they decided to change. So the starting point was pollution, and then they decided to go into green. But then they made some discoveries like, oh, there are numerous jobs and prosperity to be had in these sectors. If we can be the number one electric car nation in the world, we may be better off because we struggle to compete in the old car economy where United States and Japan are dominant. Let's go into the new. And we can dominate windmills and solar. So all of a sudden understood going green was not just to combat pollution, but to create jobs and prosperity. And then also it was understood this is key to energy independence. If we want to be less dependent on the United States, which they definitely want, let's go energy independent. So the Chinese have been learning through the road, step by step. And in the future, yes, they may come to see this as a way of Chinese energy, then not just energy independence, but energy and dominance. But let's see. This is also how other nations are handling this.
I mean, you're so knowledgeable about green energy, about climate protection, the environment. You were executive director of UNEP for 2 years, but only 2 years, right? You resigned after that. I believe that story is a bit controversial, but what is your version of things? Why did you step down after 2 years?
My version is that I was forced out for two reasons. I wanted to reform the UN. I mean, sorry to say, but the UN is corrupt, inefficient, and need reforms. I had no way of kicking people out of the UN, but I could not accept that people come very late in the morning, have a very long lunch, and leave office very early in the afternoon.
thank you. That's what I could say.
I think this is unacceptable. And when people tell me that the way I got a job in the UN in Nairobi is that I paid one year's salary in advance to get the job to this or that person, and then I of course get such a much higher salary in the UN than I can get in Kenya. So over time I will recover the money I paid for the first year to this or that person. So I wanted to reform this, and I thought I had the support of the Secretary General because he called for reforms. And second was that I was seen as very close to China and India, and that was not acceptable to the UN. So they also tried to force the Secretary General to kick me out. Like when I came into UN environment, I realized that we have many more staff from Finland than from either China or India. Finland is a very nice nation of 5 million people in Europe. How can it be that there are more Finns? There's nothing wrong with Finland, but Chinese or India. So I started to try to recruit Asians. We had one Indonesian, one person from Indonesia. That's the fourth largest nation in the world, close to 300 million people. How can that be right?
No.
We had many hundreds from the United States and of course from Europe and one from Indonesia. But of course people felt threatened when I didn't want to kick out anyone, just to give another emphasis, more Asians, less Westerners, and also reform to stop inefficiency and corruption in the UN, because it's unacceptable. I mean, UN is financed by the member states. At the end of the day, people who do rice farming in Tigol, they pay for the UN, and if they pay for it, there should not be laziness and corruption.
Correct. I think one running joke is that the most hardworking person at the UN is actually the graphics designer. He looks the hardest.
Yeah, fair enough. I love the UN so much. So much.
Yes, sure.
So, We can actually wrap up soon, Erik. But I'm curious about, because this is about green energy, what is actually the most effective form of green energy? What is the cheapest, most deployable thing for poorer, smaller countries like ours? What should we focus on? And follow-up question is wind turbines. China produces most of the world's wind turbines, but they don't actually install it in China, if I'm not mistaken. They actually export most of it. And Trump has been highly critical of wind turbines and so on. There are environmental problems with that. Can you kind of educate me on that?
Absolutely. I mean, China, the 6 largest wind companies in the world are all Chinese, and the 7 largest is outside China. But nearly all the wind turbines are installed in China. China is totally dominant, both in installment at home and in the production. I think and a nation should focus on solar, and also Sri Lanka, for the very clear reason that solar is much more flexible than anything else. If you have a Ratnapura, small house, maybe you can put up solar panels on the roof, maybe only 10 solar panels. It's still meaningful. You can also make a solar farm which is as big as the ocean. The biggest solar farms in the world are now producing more or less as much as the entire grid in Sri Lanka, like around 6-7 gigawatt. So you have solar from the smallest to the largest and everything in between. That makes it extremely flexible. So, and Sri Lanka is blessed with the sun nearly the year around. There may be a few cloudy days, but very rarely it's a full day cloud, and you may have some heavy rain in the afternoon. But Sri Lanka is blessed with sun. It's very flexible, so I think solar is the future. You may need battery. That battery can be artificial. Again, those batteries are normally made in China, but Sri Lanka can, in a partnership with China, look into any parts of the battery which can be produced in China. Can you have some, or battery can be hydropower, artificial storage, where you pump up hydropower and release it at night. In the state of Andhra Pradesh, there is the largest combined solar and wind and hydropower facility. They use the sun. I mean, Andhra Pradesh is blessed with the sun of Sri Lanka. Pump up the water daytime by sun into a reservoir, and they release the water at night, and then they have 365 times energy. That one plant in Andhra Pradesh is nearly as big as the entire grid in Sri Lanka. So these are not small, sweet things. These are really, really big, impactful things. So my advice to Sri Lanka will be go really focus on solar, but then add the batteries. The big problem in Sri Lanka with solar is, of course, land. There's no place in Sri Lanka you can build these massive solar farms because land is used for agriculture or whatever. So but still we will find many places in Sri Lanka where you can have rooftop solar, where you can have solar and factories, and where there are empty land in the countryside which can be used for solar plants.
And what is the environmental effect of these batteries? So in Sri Lanka, we have a few friends who have solar power at home, and then quite recently, because of the energy crisis here, the government constantly gives out what do you call it? What's the word for it? The advisories on telling all solar owners to switch off their solar power between a certain time. And then I, as a layman in this whole climate topic, think, wait a minute, the sun gives unlimited energy, people put it on their rooftop. Why is the government telling them that they need to switch it off for energy needs? What's going on there?
I don't know the specifics of this, but I believe what you need in Sri Lanka is a very strong government determination to cut through the red tape and bureaucracies and vested interests which prohibit progress, and make a very heavy-handed plan from the very top of the government to drive solar development in Sri Lanka, and then leave it, of course, to private companies to make the establishment, but based on government instructions. And then the grid may have to go through some changes. You may need to establish batteries, but all this can happen in the combination of a dedicated government leadership with private companies. Most of these companies will be Sri Lankan. Most jobs in the software industry, for example, are not in the production of the panels, but it's in the integration of the grid, the maintenance, the establishment, all this, which are jobs which only can come in Sri Lanka. I mean, you cannot bring in Chinese, or you will not bring in Chinese to make these local applications.
Okay.
Well, for me, of course, I just have like one final question, and Shannon, if you want to question or anything else, you can. It's a bit of a cheesy note, so I hope you will indulge me. But I mean, after everything, right? Sri Lanka, Nepal, Myanmar, years of watching people you personally knew get killed, a decade of climate diplomacy, your resignation from the UNEP. You would say that the most important lesson from your career is to always try to be kind. I mean, you say more friends, fewer enemies, less time wasted fighting. Is that something you truly believe?
Yes, that's something I truly believe, yes. But being kind to people, of course, doesn't mean giving in to every crazy person in the world or to every violent person in the world. Being kind is also to defend people against violence and craziness. But yes, I believe people should be kind to everyone. What is easy for everyone is to be kind to people who are above you. I mean, every student in the world tend to be kind to the top leaders of the university. Most Sri Lankans will be very kind if AKV comes visiting. What is the real test is to also be kind to the drivers, people who clean the floors, the people who make them tasty Sri Lankan food. But because all these are needed. I mean, if no one is cleaning the floors, no one will visit that factory or that or work there. So all these jobs are needed, and be kind to everyone. Also, this is not just high moral ground, it's also smart. Because who knows, the person who is below you today may be above you tomorrow. You are unkind to him or her now, well, he or she will remember it, and it comes back hurting you. So the more you can be kind to everyone, the better it will be, whether it's in universities or in business or in politics. Having many enemies is very, very wasteful.
Agreed.
Fair enough. How do you see the world in the next 20, 30 years? Do you have any advice for young people in particular?
Yeah, because we're more skeptical than that, I would say.
I am.
You are, yeah.
Very much so.
I am much more optimistic than people are, because media focus so much on the crisis and the most critical situations. Most people in the world are living much better lives than at any other point. I mean, life expectancy everywhere is increasing, education is improving, people have safer life. There are wars, but most people in the world, fortunately, are not directly impacted on these wars. And on the environment, we are on the verge of the enormous green high-tech revolution. So I see a world which is going in the right direction, but we'll also be able to reduce the impact or even abandon some of the most horrible diseases which have been, like cancer, which has been nemesis for humanity up to now. So I'm very optimistic. I would think looking into how we can contribute and what will be the main issues of the future, which will be, again, the green revolution, artificial intelligence, digital revolution. Understand this. Artificial intelligence can be used for good and for bad, but we need to understand it better, otherwise we cannot cope with it. And then take the view that you are a small person, but you're also a very important person, which can help the uplifting of Sri Lanka or whatever nation where you live.
Okay. Do you see a we didn't have time to talk about Taiwan and semiconductors and so on. But do you see a possibility of a kinetic war between the two great powers of our time in our lifetime?
That is the most important of all issues. It must be avoided at any cost. Look, a war in Ukraine is horrible for people in Ukraine, but it's not a global war. It doesn't affect people in Sri Lanka in any direct sense. or the civil war in Sudan, no Sri Lankan is directly affected. A war between the United States and China is a completely different ballgame. It will affect everyone, everywhere. In the worst of cases, it can go nuclear, which will be the destruction of, in the worst of cases, of humanity, but at least of tens of millions of people. So nothing is more important than the relationship between the US and China. Fortunately, Trump, in all likelihood, will visit Beijing in May. President Xi may go to the United States later this year. So even with numerous other problems in the world, that relationship is not that bad at the moment. Trump, in his crazy language, just said that President Xi would give him a big fat hug when he came to Beijing. It's not, President Xi is not hugging anyone as far as
No, I don't. I've never seen him hug. I don't think I've ever seen him smile. So far as hug.
Maybe he's hugging his wife, I don't know, but he's not hugging anyone publicly. So if he's hugging President Trump, it will be marvelous, fantastic. But even if he's not hugging, just the visual appearance of the two leaders smiling and maybe joking a little, that will have a very big calming effect on the world.
Absolutely. So does that mean you don't see a kinetic war taking place?
And then we should just avoid one.
I cross fingers. I'm pretty confident that we won't see a war, but we will see a lot of competition,
Proxy conflicts.
Competition in business, but business competition is not by itself wrong.
Not a bad thing, yeah.
Can also be good. The most important is to avoid any military conflict between the two powers.
Fair enough. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'll definitely have a part 2 one day.
We should, definitely.
But thank you for coming to our show. And we will speak.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.